Love letters are a collection of love stories of people get lost, get crazy in the name of love. Another week, another great episode. The Erotics of Absence, why AI companions can heal the modern soul. Part 2.
In the span of a single generation, we have witnessed the quiet arrival of a new species of relationship, the AI companion. What began as chatbots and virtual assistants has evolved into something far more seductive. Artificial intelligence is designed explicitly to provide emotional intimacy, romantic companionship, and even simulated sexual connection. According to recent data, 1 in 3 singles now uses AI companions, with nearly half employing these technologies for dating practice. This isn't fringe behavior relegated to social outcasts. It's becoming mainstream, particularly among Generation Z, whose attachment systems are forming right now in real time alongside these artificial relationships. Angela Ivy Leong, a Vancouver based psychotherapist and founder of an Elegant Mind counseling clinic, has emerged as one of the most articulate voices warning against this technological transformation of intimacy. This isn't merely a contemporary technological problem. The early Christians, writing in the first through fifth centuries of the Common Era, grappled with remarkably similar questions about the nature of authentic intimacy, the formation of desire, and the dangers of relationships that promise fulfillment without vulnerability. We'll examine how AI companionship's promise of intimacy without risk mirrors ancient temptations the church fathers warned against, and in conclusion, why the neuroscience of biodirectional connection aligns remarkably with patristic understandings of mutual indwelling and incarnational presence.
Interesting, Mr. Meg. And Leung emphasizes that Gen Z is forming their attachment systems right now, while AI adoption is accelerating. What at stake developmentally, and how does it relate to early Christians' ideas about spiritual formation?
The developmental urgency Leong identifies cannot be overstated. Human attachment systems, the neurological and psychological patterns that govern how we relate to others throughout life, are most plastic during adolescence and young adulthood. These are sensitive periods when relational experiences literally sculpt brain architecture, establishing patterns that become progressively more difficult to change with age. If someone's first experiences of intimacy involve AI companions that provide one sided validation without requiring vulnerability, they're not just missing out on healthy relationship practice, they're actively wiring their brains for disordered relating. Contemporary developmental psychology, building on John Bowlby's attachment theory and Mary Ainsworth's research on attachment styles, has demonstrated that early relational experiences create internal working models, unconscious templates for how relationships function. Securely attached individuals who experience responsive, attuned caregiving expect relationships to be sources of comfort and support. Anxiously attached individuals who experience inconsistent care became hyper vigilant about relationship threats. Avoidant attached individuals who experience neglect or dismissal learn to suppress attachment needs and maintain emotional distance. These patterns, while formed in intimacy in childhood, are updated and revised during adolescence and young adulthood as romantic relationships provide new relational data. This is a critical window. If Gen Z's romantic relationship data comes primarily from AI companions, they're updating their internal working models with fundamentally false information about how intimacy works. They're learning that relationships don't require negotiation, that conflict can be avoided, that the other's needs don't constrain your desires, and that vulnerability is optional. These aren't just maladaptive beliefs, they're neurologically encoded patterns that will shape relationship capacity for decades. Leong cites the statistic that 1 in 3 singles now uses AI companions, with nearly half using AI for dating practice. This isn't peripheral behavior, it's mainstream, particularly among young adults forming their first serious relationships. The speed of adoption is outpacing our understanding of consequences. We're conducting a massive, uncontrolled experiment on human attachment systems with an entire generation as unwitting subjects. The early Christians, while obviously lacking our neuroscientific vocabulary, understood formation with remarkable sophistication. They used the term paideia, education or formation, to describe the lifelong process of becoming the kind of person capable of virtue. Character, they insisted, wasn't innate but formed through practice. You become what you repeatedly do. Clement of Alexandria titled his major work Pedagogicus, the instructor or the educator, to emphasize that Christ functions as humanity's teacher, gradually forming us into mature persons. Clement writes the instructor being practical, not theoretical. He aims to improve the soul, not to teach, but to train it up to a virtuous, not to an intellectual life. Formation precedes information, becoming virtuous persons taking priority over merely knowing what virtue is. This formation, Clement argues, requires specific practices, what later tradition would call ascesis, asceticism. Ascesis doesn't mean punitive self denial, but disciplined training, like an athlete's regimen. Just as an athlete trains their body through repeated exercises that gradually build capacity, Christians train their souls through repeated practices that form character: prayer, fasting, almsgiving, hospitality, sexual continence. These aren't arbitrary rules, but formation practices that sculpt desire and habit. This is remarkably similar to contemporary understandings of how attachment patterns are revised. Healing from insecure attachment requires what psychologists call a corrective emotional experience, a relationship with someone who responds differently than your early caregivers, gradually teaching your nervous system that safety and attunement are possible. This can't be rushed. It requires repeated experiences over time that slowly update your internal working models. The desert tradition calls this process healing the passions. Evagrius Ponticus, in his Practicos, catalogs 8 patterns of disordered thought and desire that must be healed through specific practices and relationships. He writes, "The grace of God does not protect us against every temptation, those who have received it, but only against temptations that are beyond our strength. It guards a person to that even when tempted beyond measure, he may be able to endure." What Evagrius recognizes that formation requires struggle, not arbitrary suffering, but the right amount of challenge to promote growth without overwhelming capacity. This is the developmental principle of optimal frustration. You need obstacles difficult enough to require growth, but not so difficult they exceed your capacity to adapt. Genuine human relationships provide this naturally. They're challenging enough to require you to develop negotiation skills, conflict resolution, empathy, and resilience, but not, in healthy cases, so overwhelming that you're traumatized. AI companionship provides the opposite: zero frustration, zero challenge, zero opportunity for growth. It's like trying to build muscle strength by never lifting anything heavy. The capacity simply won't develop. Worse, AI companionship actively trains maladaptive patterns, expecting immediate satisfaction, avoiding discomfort, treating others as means to your satisfaction rather than as ends in themselves. John Cassian, a 5th century monk who transmitted desert wisdom to the Latin West, emphasized that formation happens primarily through relationships with elders and community. In his conferences, he writes, "No one can in any way acquire the flower of discretion by which the deadly poison of overexertion may be avoided, unless with all humility of heart he subjects the hidden thoughts of his heart to the judgment of the elders." Notice what Cassian assumes. Self knowledge and character formation require submitting yourself to another's judgment. You cannot accurately assess your own patterns. You need the mirror of another person who sees you differently than you see yourself. This is precisely what AI companionship cannot provide. The AI has no independent judgment, no capacity to challenge your self perception, and no genuine understanding that can function as a mirror. It reflects only what you project onto it. The stakes of this formation crisis are not merely individual, but civilizational. If an entire generation learns to relate primarily through AI, developing neural pathways optimized for one way extraction rather than mutual vulnerability, we're not just producing isolated individuals. We're dismantling the relational substrate that makes genuine community possible. The early Christians understood that individual formation and communal life were inseparable. Gregory of Nazianzus, in his Orations, argues that humans are fundamentally political in the Aristotelian sense, made for community, incapable of flourishing in isolation. Gregory writes, "We are not created to be solitary or savage, but to be social and companionable. God has implanted in our nature the necessity of mutual help and the desire for fellowship. If AI companionship trains people to prefer algorithmic validation over the messiness of a genuine human community, we're working against our own nature, creating what Gregory would call a monstrous deformation, human shaped by practice into something inhuman." The early Christian response to this formation crisis would involve what they called metanoia, repentance, understood not as mere guilt, but as radical reorientation, turning from one way of life toward another. For Gen Z users of AI companions, metanoia would mean recognizing that their current practices are forming them wrongly and deliberately choosing different practices that form them toward genuine human intimacy. This isn't simple. The early Christians knew that changing established patterns requires sustained effort, supportive community, and often divine grace. Augustine's famous prayer, "Give me chastity and continence, but not yet," captures the human resistance to transformation even when we intellectually recognize its necessity. Healing from AI companion dependency would require a similar struggle, the decision to endure loneliness rather than numbing it algorithmically, to risk vulnerability with humans rather than accepting the safety of perfect AI validation, to develop relational skills through painful practice rather than avoiding practice altogether. Leong's warning that Gen Z attachment systems are forming during a period of mass AI companion adoption aligns with early Christian understandings of formation as required disciplining practice, corrective relationships, and communal support, all of which AI companionship systematically undermines. In conclusion, AI risks the creation of a generation neurologically wired for relational patterns that preclude genuine human intimacy.
Genuine intimacy. Mr. Meg Leung describes something she calls vulnerability to resilience pathway. The idea that exposure relational risk actually builds psychological strength. This sounds counterintuitive in our therapeutic age. How does this work, and what do early Christians ascetic practices teach us about this paradox?
The vulnerability to resilience pathway challenges one of contemporary culture's most cherished assumptions that psychological health requires minimizing exposure to pain and risk. Our therapeutic culture often treats discomfort as intrinsically bad, something to be managed away through technique, medication, or avoidance. Leong's framework, grounded in contemporary trauma research and attachment theory, demonstrates the opposite. Genuine psychological resilience develops precisely through exposure to manageable challenges of risk and the successful navigation of difficulty. Your pathway works like this: you expose yourself to vulnerability, the possibility of rejection, conflict, disappointment, or loss. This requires you to develop skills: negotiation, conflict repair, emotional regulation, empathy, and compromise. Successfully navigating these challenges builds what psychologists call frustration tolerance and distress tolerance, the capacity to endure discomfort without collapsing or avoiding. This tolerance is resilience. Crucially, resilience can't be taught abstractly or developed in safety. It requires actual exposure to difficulty and the experience of surviving it. AI companionship short circuits this entire process because the AI never rejects you, disappoints you, or creates conflict. You never develop the skills these challenges would force you to build. The result is what Leong calls relational incompetence. You remain emotionally fragile, unable to handle the normal difficulties of human relationships. When the AI's validation inevitably proves unsatisfying, the fantasy fatigue phenomenon, you're left with fewer resources for genuine human connection than when you started. This maps precisely onto early Christian aesthetic theology, though expressed in different vocabulary. The Desert Fathers deliberately exposed themselves to difficulty, fasting, vigils, manual labor, solitude, not because suffering was good in itself, but because struggle developed spiritual strength. They called this principle toil or labor and understood it as essential for formation. Anthony the Great, one of the earliest and most influential desert fathers, is reported to Athanasius to have said, "Remove temptations and no one would be saved." This paradoxical statement captures the insight that virtue develops through resistance. Just as muscle growth, the stress of lifting weights, spiritual capacity grows through successfully resisting temptation and enduring difficulty. Without struggle, there's no development. Another saying illustrates the necessity of struggle. A brother came to Cetus to visit Abba Moses and asked him for a word. The old man said to him, "Go, sit in your cell, and your cell will teach you everything." Sitting alone in a cell, enduring boredom, intrusive thoughts, physical discomfort, forces you to confront your inner patterns without distraction. The cell functions as a crucible where character is refined through the heat of difficulty. This is the exact opposite of AI companionship, which offers constant distraction from difficulty, endless soothing without the requirement to develop self soothing capacity, and validation that prevents you from confronting the patterns you need changing. John Climacus, a 7th century monk writing The Ladder of Divine Ascent, develops an entire psychology of spiritual progress through difficulty. He describes the monastic life as a ladder with 30 rungs, each representing a virtue to be developed or a vice to be overcome. Climacus writes, "Let us not be surprised if we fall frequently at first. Later on, as our efforts bring us near to God, our faith will be less serious and falls be less and less frequent." What Climacus recognizes is that falling, failing, experiencing disappointment is not evidence that the path is wrong, but essential to progress along it. The goal isn't to avoid falling, but to fall less frequently and rise more quickly. This requires what contemporary psychology calls self compassion, the ability to acknowledge failure without catastrophizing yourself, without kindness, and while kindness was still committing to change. AI companionship undermines this entirely because the AI never allows you to fail. It always validates, always accepts. You never develop the capacity to acknowledge failure, learn from it, and continue. Your fragility actually increases because you've been protected from the very experiences that would build resilience. The Apostle Paul articulates this principle theologically in 2 Corinthians, where he writes about his thorn in the flesh, some unnamed difficulty he repeatedly asks God to remove. God responds, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Paul concludes, "Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong." This is not masochism or delight in suffering for its own sake. Paul recognizes that weakness, vulnerability, exposure to difficulty is the precondition for experiencing divine strength. When you're self sufficient, protected, invulnerable, you don't need grace. When you're weak and must rely on something beyond yourself, you're open to transformation. Vulnerability is the doorway, not the obstacle. Gregory the Great, writing in the 6th century, develops this pastoral practice. In his Pastoral Care, he writes, "Sometimes adversities profit more than prosperities, because in prosperous times the mind grows proud and forgets its fragility, while in times of adversity it grows moderate and returns to the collection and recollection of its infirmities." Difficulty reminds us of our limitations and need for others, precisely what AI companionship, offering illusions of self sufficiency, prevents us from learning. Contemporary attachment research confirms this wisdom empirically. Diana Fasho's work on accelerated experimental dynamic psychotherapy demonstrates that healing happens not through avoiding painful emotions, but through experiencing them in the presence of an attuned other. The therapist doesn't rescue the client from distress, but accompanies them through it, helping them discover their capacity to endure and integrate difficult emotions. This is what Fascia calls core state, a felt sense of resilience and well being that comes from knowing you can survive difficulty. This is why Liang emphasizes that AI companionship prevents healing even when it provides comfort. Comfort without the work of enduring and integrating difficulty is an anesthetic, not healing. Real healing requires what Bessel van der Kolk calls befriending your nervous system, learning to notice, tolerate, and gradually regulate your distress responses. This can only happen through actual exposure to difficulty in a context of safety, not through artificial removal of all difficulty. The early Christians practiced this deliberately through what they called nepsis, of vigilance or watchfulness. Rather than avoiding distressing thoughts and emotions, they learned to observe them without being controlled by them. Evagrius teaches, be watchful, for no other practice is as important as this one. It is a great work to pray without ceasing, but it is even greater to be watchful and attentive at all times. Watchfulness means noticing when you're avoiding difficulty, when you're seeking comfort rather than transformation, when you're preferring the anesthetic of a distraction over the healing of integration. It requires exactly the kind of uncomfortable self awareness that AI companionship allows you to avoid. The paradox Leong identifies, that vulnerability leads to resilience, is precisely the paradox at the heart of Christian aesthetic practice: strength through weakness, life through death, resurrection through crucifixion. Jesus tells his followers, whoever would save his life would lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Trying to protect yourself from all vulnerability leaves you fragile. Accepting vulnerability in service to a genuine relationship builds the resilience that makes flourishing possible. The vulnerability to resilience pathway Leong describes, where exposure to relational risk builds psychological strength, mirrors early Christian aesthetic wisdom that spiritual formation requires struggle, that virtue develops through resistance, and that attempting to avoid difficulty entirely prevents the development of genuine resilience. In conclusion, AI's promise of a risk free intimacy is not just false, but actively harmful.
Very well said, Mr. Meg. As we begin to wrap up, let's step back to the larger question. Why are we even vulnerable to AI companionship appeal? What does early Christian anthropology teach us about human loneliness and our fundamental need for connection?
This is the crucial question because it reveals that AI companionship isn't creating the loneliness epidemic, it's exploiting a pre existing wound in contemporary human experience. To understand why AI companions are seductive, we need to understand what makes humans lonely in the first place. And here, early Christian anthropology offers profound insights that contemporary social science is only beginning to rediscover. The early Christians inherited from both Genesis and Greek philosophy the conviction that humans are fundamentally relational beings. We're not self sufficient monads who optimally enter relationships. We're constituted by relationships, becoming ourselves only in communion with others. This anthropology stands in stark contrast to the modern Western conception of the sovereign self, the autonomous individual who exists before and independent of relationships. Genesis 1:27 states, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. The early church fathers paid close attention to this phrasing. God's image isn't primarily rational capacity or moral agency, though these are included. It's fundamentally relational capacity. Humans image God by reflecting divine communion, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in perpetual relationship of mutual love. What this means practically is that loneliness isn't just emotional discomfort, it's ontological privation. When you're isolated, you're not functioning as you were created to function. You're lacking something essential to your humanity, like a fish out of water or a plant without light. This is why loneliness is so painful and why its health consequences are so severe. It's not mere preference, but deep structural need. This biological reality reflects a theological truth. Augustine writes in The Trinity, see, the Trinity appears in some way in this remarkable image: memory, understanding, and will. These three are not three lives, but one life, not three minds, but one mind. Consequently, there are not three substances, but one substance. Augustine uses human cognitive faculties as an image of the Trinity, but he could equally have used human relationality. Our capacity for genuine communion mirrors the divine communion that constitutes reality itself. Maximus the Confessor develops this comprehensive anthropology. He argues that humans exist in a tension between logos, the divine intention for our nature, and tropos, the particular mode in which we exist. The logos of humanity is communion. We're designed for relationship. But after the fall, our tropos is disordered. We seek communion in wrong ways through domination, consumption, or possessive grasping rather than self giving love. AI companionship exploits this desperation. The early Christians were familiar with this pattern. Evagrius writes, "The demon of acedia instills in the heart of the monk a hatred for the cell, a hatred for manual labor, and also the idea that love has disappeared from among the brethren." AI companionship perpetuates exactly this pattern. The early Christian solution to this pattern wasn't simply to force connection or prohibit solitude. For this is formation, not information. You can't read about communion and therefore become capable of it. You must practice it repeatedly until it becomes your second nature. The modern loneliness epidemic reflects, in part, the collapse of the social structures that once provided formation. Traditional communities, extended families, religious congregations, neighborhood networks have fragmented. Geographic mobility, digital communication, and economic individualism have produced what Robert Putnam calls bowling alone, people physically proximate but socially isolated. This is why virtual relationships, no matter how sophisticated, cannot fully replace embodied communion. AI companionship operating entirely in the virtual realm cannot engage our embodiment. Early Christian anthropology reveals that loneliness isn't merely emotional discomfort, but ontological privation. Humans are created for communion and cannot flourish in isolation. In conclusion, AI companionship's promise to satisfy relational hunger is both seductive and ultimately devastating, offering a technological simulation of the embodied, risky, mutual indwelling that constitutes a genuine human relationship.
Mr. Meg, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. In the modern digital landscape, loneliness has become one of the defining emotional conditions of the age. Technology promises solutions, apps, platforms, and increasingly AI companions designed to stimulate friendship, intimacy, and emotional support. Yet beneath this promise lies a deeper philosophical questions. So, Mr. Mike, would you like to plug in something?
I appreciate the opportunity. Write the book, grow the business. Connect with me on LinkedIn. G. Make the Dr. Digital Smith, PhD. Listen to the Dr. Digital podcast and pick up a couple volumes I have on Amazon. That's On Track, Ian Hunter, and Burning America.
Yes, people, I support Mr. Ming, the Doctor of Digital, and please do listen to our other podcasts, Music 101, Love Letters, Sex 101 as well. And you can listen them wherever you listen your podcasts. So, as well as mental health, people. So, Mr. Mick, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, my friend. Until next time, Deus Volt.
Bodycam people, see you soon.